There's one thing that a lot of people aren't aware of that will give them better glute activation, whether your goals are for better movement, posture, or just performance in the gym. And this thing is actually your big toe in your foot. Now, if that seems crazy, let me break down for a second how this actually works. Your glute max is obviously on the back side of your pelvis. Now, this muscle attaches both on the pelvis itself and on the femur. Now, what this muscle does is it takes the pelvis and femur from a position of internal rotation and compresses the backside of the pelvis to create external rotation. Now, I'm going to be significantly exaggerating the movement that actually happens within the pelvis here, so that way you can clearly see what I'm talking about. But in reality, these movements are much smaller than what I'm showing you. Now, when this muscle contracts, it is going to close off the back space of the pelvis and bring the femur into an externally rotated position. For that to happen, we have to move from a position that is relatively more internally rotated. And the reason for this is because we're in this hinged position in about 90 degrees of hip bend or flexion. We sometimes literally feel what's going on here where the glutes stretch out. And this is a very internally rotated position where the outlet right here opens up. Rather than being tight like this, it's going to open up in the back, and that's going to put the pelvis in an internally rotated position. So that way, your glutes have leverage to produce force and stand you up from there into that hip extended position. We have 3 phases of the gait cycle: heel strike to mid stance to propulsion or toe off. Now, heel strike, that phase ends when the heel hits the ground and then the big toe makes contact with the ground. At this point, we are in more of this negative shin angle. And then when we move to mid stance, we're going to move into more of an internally rotated position from a position of relative external rotation. Heel strike, that first phase, ends when the heel hits the ground and then the big toe after it. This is a higher arch position of the foot, more of this negative shin angle, and also more of an externally rotated position of our pelvis and hip. As we move into mid stance, we transition more weight onto the inside edge of our foot arch. The arch is going to flatten out. The tibia is going to internally rotate along with the hip, which is going to internally rotate. Now, it's really important here that we can transfer from an externally rotated position to an internally rotated position. The only way that can happen is if the big toe makes contact with the ground. If we can't transition from our heel to our big toe effectively, then we're never going to be able to have internal rotation feed from our hips to the ground and the ground back up to our hips. Now we're shifting more weight relatively onto our forefoot for propulsion. So at this point, we need to move from an internally rotated position, and now the glutes have more leverage, like we talked about before, to help push us forward. And that happens when the big toe, that first metatarsal head specifically, is on the ground. You see people that stay on the outside edge of their foot when they walk or when they stand have trouble, obviously, keeping their big toe flat on the ground. If they're staying on the outside edge of their foot and they can't transfer weight efficiently onto the inside edge of their foot and that first metatarsal head, the big toe right here, then they're not going to be able to put force through the ground effectively and be able to access that internal rotation. And remember, that internal rotation space is necessary for us to use our glutes and push back into external rotation. That big toe sort of cues our glutes to actually work and push us. Allow me to visualize that for you. As I take a step forward, I'm going to be on my heel, and then that heel strike phase ends when my big toe makes contact with the ground. I'm in an externally rotated position at this point, and I'm beginning to shift my body weight onto that stance leg where my arch needs to drop at this point. Now, this is more of an internally rotated position of mid-stance. From there, I'm going to transfer my body weight forward, push myself over to the other side, and that's when I move from that internally rotated position in mid-stance to an externally rotated position as I push my body weight over to the other side and I turn away from that side. Almost every single time I see someone struggle to keep their big toe on the ground when they're doing something like a squat or a deadlift or a split squat activity, and that big toe lifts and it looks like they're losing their balance, they're almost always going to struggle to feel their glutes in the way that they need to, and also they're going to be missing hip internal rotation. Because remember, to keep the big toe on the ground means that they can transfer their body weight onto the inside edge of that arch where we need to access internal rotation. These people also often, but not always, have these higher arched feet because this is more of an externally rotated position of the foot, and they tend to sit on the outside edge of their feet, even in a standing position. Now, that was a good bit of information. Let me summarize what I just discussed. In order for us to access our glutes, whether we are walking or lifting weights, we need to have big toe contact with the ground. Because when we are moving through the world, we need to move from an externally rotated position and then layer internal rotation onto that. That internally rotated position cues our glutes to push us over to the other side or push us from the bottom of a squat or deadlift up into that hip extended position. So you need hip internal rotation in order to use your glutes effectively. So given this information and the need of the foot arch to use the glutes well, why would we do exercises to activate the glutes like banded clamshell activities, where there's no reference of the foot on a grounded surface to educate the body and say, hey, when my foot arch and big toes in contact with the ground, I want my glutes to be able to work. That's what's important, and that's a missing link in a lot of people's rehab and also warm-up activities. But that's a very important concept that I try to cover in my programs, like my beginner body restoration program. The good news is we can hit multiple birds with one stone here. And we can do exercises where we're cueing the contacts of the foot arch while we improve hip internal rotation and move into a position of hip internal rotation. So this is one way you can do that. So what we need to do is hold onto a rack with the free hand, and the weight's gonna be the opposite side of the foot that is forward. So we're gonna go left foot forward here, and then we're gonna get in a position, and a general rule that seems to work is that we want the inclination of the trunk to be in line with that back leg. So we're gonna have a little bit tiny more split stance than we would in a normal split squat here. So about this degree of inclination is what we're looking for right there, but it's going to be very much individual depending on you as a person. Might be more, might be less, and we'll coach you up on that. But generally, this is what we're looking for right here. So we're gonna stay really heavy on the front foot right there, keeping the heel flat, making really sure we don't lose that heel. And then we're just gonna squat down, inhale, exhale, come up. Again, not losing that heel. The most common mistake in this is people are going to stand up too early. And normally in a split squat, we do want to be upright, but on this, we do not. So as people go down, they're going to have a tendency for the shoulders to drift back like that, and then they'll shoot their butt back or just go straight up out of the bottom. So we want to make sure we stay slightly bent over the entire time, and we want to keep that same torso angle throughout the whole split squat. And if you want to use your glutes better in exercises, you want to keep your whole foot flat. You never want to lose the outside or inside part of your foot when you're moving through a squat or a deadlift. But when you push, think about pushing through the inner heel and this first metatarsal head right here. That will get you to move through an internally rotated to externally rotated position again. Now, if you want to progress to a full glute bridge, keep that ball in between the knees to make sure things stay aligned. But now it's more of a push. So what you want to focus on is the first metatarsal head and the inner heel. So on my foot right here, and right here, where the ball of the big toe is. It's not your actual big toe, it's right in here. Now that doesn't mean I roll onto the inside of that and lose my outside foot. We're still keeping the whole foot flat, but that's where about 2/3 of our pressure is gonna be on each foot. Now the same cue applies. Exhale through your mouth and get a couple of the vertebrae off of the ground, pushing through the arch of the feet. Those foot contacts, you're gonna feel your glutes engage. Now, inhale through your nose, pause that position, exhale, couple more vertebrae, being that piece of Velcro. And you're going to peel off more and more. You're gonna get to a position where you can't go any higher after a couple of breaths, or else you're gonna extend your back. Well, that's your end range hip extension. Go back down, and then over time, you can work into more and more hip extension as you get better at this. You'll know you're at your end range because, well, your back is going to start working. You're going to feel that. But not only that, your ribs are going to start flaring. So you're going to feel that pop out, your belly's going to pop up. And now you're using your low back to substitute for hip extension because you passed your end range hip extension. Now you need to use something else. And for most people, that's their low back.